IT, are you ready to go? Awesome. Thank you very much. Sheriff, if you would flip the switch on that door for me. I would, other side. Flip it down and then keep going. Well, probably not the light switch. A little bit further over. There's one that says door open. Thank you. Appreciate that. It'll close on its own now.
Look who's here.
All right. Thank you guys very much for being here today. This is our first meeting, actually. We tried to meet twice last week. One was canceled due to weather, and the other one was canceled, well, because the speaker said he's going pro forma, and why keep everybody here on a Thursday late in the afternoon if we don't have to? So welcome. Thank you guys for all being here. Thank you all for your willingness to serve with us this year on this committee. There aren't any changes to the rules, same rules as last year, but I would just call your attention to those rules that are listed at ks.gov under our House Corrections Committee. If you have any questions, let me know. I would also ask, just a reminder, in the event that you are not going to be here, if you would just shoot me a text, send me an email, let me know. Sometimes we get later in the session, we got votes, we need to make sure we have people, and just helps us keep track of everything. So appreciate that. And the last thing before we move on with our committee, I want to introduce Stephen Nguyen. Stephen, would you stand up back there? Stephen is my intern this year, so any complaints, go to him. Thanks, Stephen. With that in mind, do we have any requests for bill introductions today? I believe I have one, don't I, Natalie? And what would that one be? Awesome.
The RS number for that one's 2425.
Excellent. 24 RS 2425, and that is dealing with post-incarceration identification and doing a little bit more than we currently do to ensure our inmates being released from KDOC custody get released with proper forms of identification. So, is there any objection to that being requested? Yep, certainly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to make sure I'm clear. This is Representative Owens on behalf of Representative Owens as opposed to on behalf of some other group, because oftentimes the chair does introduce bills on behalf of others, and we want to make sure that those lines are filled out on the bill page.
Fair question, and I appreciate that, because we wouldn't want to sign you up to sponsor a bill without your permission.
That's right.
Yes, this is Representative Owens on behalf of Representative Owens requesting that the committee chaired by Representative Owens introduces 24 RS 2420.
And I certainly have no objection to the bill introduced by Representative Owens on behalf of Representative Owens. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Excellent. Are there any additional, that'll be introduced. Are there any additional requests? All right, seeing none. Today is our annual State of our Law Enforcement. Today's the day that I look forward to every year that we receive just information from all the various law enforcement agencies that represent our great state. And so with that in mind, we have an opportunity to hear what's on their mind, to hear what we can do to further support them. So we'll start off by asking Director Tony Mativi of the Kansas Bureau of Investigation to stand up and share a few things with us. Director, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to provide testimony regarding the KBI's concerns and trends regarding public safety issues here in Kansas. We're very grateful for your time, and we're very grateful for your attention to these issues that dramatically impact our state and the quality of lives of our fellow Kansans. That said, let me just dive right in and tell you what trends we're seeing from last year's crime statistics. Unfortunately, violent crime continues to rise, not just nationally, but even here in Kansas. The 2023 data isn't finally compiled yet, but looking at the 2022 data, violent crime was up almost 3%, and it remains 17.5% above the 10-year average. Interestingly enough, the only category of violent crime that declined was murder. That has to be taken in context, though, I submit, because the decline was very mild. It follows several years of very dramatic increases. It's still well above the 10-year average, and we're not even down to pre-pandemic levels. So although there was a very mild decline in homicides, I don't view it as statistically significant. As you all know, we at the KBI don't have the resources to focus on all crimes, so we have to prioritize. Our priorities, not only under my predecessor, Director Thompson, but that continue with me, are violent crime, crimes against children, public corruption, and the difference between the last administration and mine is the emphasis on fentanyl because of the numbers that we're seeing, and I'll talk with you more about those in a few moments. But where the rubber hits the road on that is because we have to prioritize, and violent crime is one of our priorities. If that number continues to rise, that means we're going to have to devote increasing resources to it, right? Unfortunately, we're seeing the same thing with regard to crimes against children, and specifically internet crimes against children. These are crimes that involve the distribution of what we call CSAM, child sexual abuse material. And unfortunately, although at first glance, you think, well, that's just the distribution of images. Why would that be a grave concern when you have to prioritize on violent crime and public corruption? Well, the reason it's a priority is because when we look back historically at our ICAC, Internet Crimes Against Children cases, one of the things we found is that in more than 50% of those cases, there's actual contact with a child. So these aren't just cases involving the trading of images or the online distribution of images. There is a statistically significant block of those cases that actually involve contact with a child. So that's why those ICAC or Internet Crimes Against Children cases are a priority for us. And like I said, those continue to increase as well. Now, in 2018, the legislature funded the Northeast Kansas Child Victim Task Force. We have 3 regions at the KBI. We break the state into Northeast, West, and Southeast. So in 2018, the legislature funded a Northeast Kansas Child Victim Task Force that got stood up and began operating in 2019. And the numbers that that task force has generated as far as investigations handled and cases solved have been significant. And they've had a dramatic impact on those kinds of crimes in the northeast part of our state. Last year, we came to you and we asked you for funding to create a similar unit in the West region. You gave us that funding, and we are now in the process of standing up that unit out of our Garden City office, our Garden City office in the West region. This session, we will be back, and I don't want to turn this into a budget session, but I just want to close the loop and let you know that this session we'll be back asking for funding to stand up a child victim unit in the Southeast region, sort of to give us sort of full state coverage when it comes to internet crimes and crimes against children. We're seeing some emerging threats that I think it's important for everyone in the legislature to know about as the session kicks off. We're seeing increased swatting attacks. You're familiar with those as false calls that are placed to dispatch centers. We've seen a couple of waves of those within recent weeks. We saw a national wave of swatting attacks against public officials nationwide, but one member of the Kansas federal delegation was a victim of one of those attacks. A few days later, we saw a wave of swatting attacks against Kansas healthcare institutions, particularly hospitals. And what we were seeing was false calls of bomb threats at these healthcare institutions, all in Kansas. So we're seeing increased swatting on a nationwide basis and here in Kansas with Kansans as victims. So we want you to be aware of that. We're seeing increase in cyber threats overall, but in particular, 3 specific types: intrusions, data breaches, and ransomware. We have to be in a position to respond to those, and we submit there are 3 ways in which the responses are most effective. Number 1 is to educate users, because what we know is that the most common way for a bad actor to get into a system is through contact with a human being who either doesn't understand the request or somehow provides information to the bad actors and allows them into the system. So educating users is a particularly important response to the increase that we're seeing in cyber attacks. We also have to be able to strengthen our infrastructure to protect against those attacks. And finally, we have to have the resources to respond to the attacks and investigate. So for example, when there's an attack on a law enforcement system in Kansas, which we have seen within the last year, there was an attack on one of the smaller, one of the mid-sized police departments in the state. We don't just respond to investigate, we also have to respond to assist. We have to terminate their access to the main system to keep the infection from spreading from that local department to our statewide systems. But then as the KBI, we have an obligation to try to help them get back up and have access to the information that they need for their officers who are continuing to respond to calls. So educating users, beefing up the infrastructure, and being able to respond and assist are three important measures when it comes to cyber attacks. Finally, we're seeing the targeting of public officials. I don't need to tell this body about that. We saw it last spring with the white powder letters. Unfortunately, there are increasing numbers of these attacks across the country as we head into what we all expect to be a fairly contentious political season. I'm afraid that we're going to see more of those rather than to have this problem go away. And that leads me to my biggest concern about those kinds of attacks, and that is we will at some point in this country see fentanyl weaponized. Let that sink in for a moment. Fentanyl is so widely available and so cheap that it would have been cheap and easy for a person who is sending letters to sprinkle enough fentanyl across all of those letters to cause adverse consequences to anybody who handled or opened the letters. Okay? We haven't seen one of those yet, but I view it as an inevitability. Imagine, if you would, if only 1% of those letters had had a fatal amount of fentanyl for someone to be exposed to when the letters were open. 1%, that would have been 2 dead legislators or family members. Even if it was only 5%, that would have been, we would have been dealing with 10 fatalities, right, of those approximately 186 letters. So that is a big concern with regard to those threats. That leads me to fentanyl. Fentanyl submissions to the KBI Crime Laboratory continue to increase, and they continue to increase at a dramatic rate. Just 2 milligrams of fentanyl is a fatal dose. DEA last year said that 7 out of every 10 pills that they were testing at their laboratory had a potentially fatal dose of fentanyl. So the lethality of this drug is staggering. The drug is increasingly available, and make no mistake, fentanyl is a cartel-driven product. There is no fentanyl that's being distributed in our state that's not provided by and trafficked in here by one of the major Mexican drug cartels. The days of this being an issue of the Chinese providing it and importing it into the country, those days are gone. The cartels have realized that fentanyl is the most profitable drug our society has ever seen. The cartels elbowed the Chinese out of the way, and they now are responsible for all of the fentanyl that's being trafficked into our state. We're seeing fentanyl sold on its own, just as fentanyl pills for the most part, although you may be aware that last month KBI had a significant drug seizure in Wichita, 59 pounds of crystal meth, 60,000 fentanyl pills, and approximately 2 kilograms of fentanyl powder. That's well over $1 million worth of drugs taken off the street in that seizure. But what it tells us is we're not just seeing the pills distributed here, we're also seeing it come in powder form, which is very disturbing. But we're seeing it sold on its own, we're seeing it mixed with all other types of illegal drugs, And finally, we're seeing it hidden in pills. We call these fake pills like Xanax or Adderall, where the user wouldn't necessarily expect to encounter fentanyl, but it's being placed in there. Now, people ask me fairly regularly, well, that doesn't make sense, right? If the cartel is behind this product, what kind of business model does it have them killing their customers? That's not the business model, all right? The business model is to addict as many people as you possibly can. So even if it's a Xanax or an Adderall, when the user encounters a fentanyl high, even if he or she isn't expecting it, that person will then become a fentanyl user and is addicted to the product. That's the business model. That's why we're seeing it laced into these fake pills. And we're seeing that very consistently, very broadly across the state. So not only is it incredibly lethal, it's increasingly available, the street prices continue to plummet. So the problem with fentanyl is only going to get worse before it gets better. Meth is still king here in Kansas. When you look at the number of submissions we get to the KBI lab, we typically get about 9,000 to 9,500 submissions on an annual basis. More of those are meth than any other drug. Second place is marijuana, and it has been for several years. Third place is fentanyl, but the really concerning thing about fentanyl is the trajectory, right? The number increases year over year over year. We're not seeing it plateau. We're not even seeing it taper off. Fentanyl overdose deaths right now are the leading cause of death for Americans under 40 years old. More than automobile accidents, more than firearms, the leading cause of death for Americans under 40 is fentanyl overdoses. So when we talk about disturbing criminal justice trends, we agree with the Attorney General, we agree with HIDTA, the High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area Executive Board. Fentanyl is the most prominent, the most concerning drug issue, and I would argue criminal justice issue that we're seeing in Kansas today. I'm running out of time. I'll just quickly hit on a couple of other issues, Mr. Chairman, if you'll let me. Aging and antiquated infrastructure has become an issue. It's an issue not just for the KBI, but for all of law enforcement. The governor's budget recommendations already have helped us address some of those, so we may be back asking the legislature for assistance, or at least concurrence on those and assistance as well. And then from my colleagues who are up next, you're going to hear a lot, I suspect, about staffing issues. Recruiting and retention are a big issue all across law enforcement. It's no different at the KBI. I can tell you right now, we have a staff of commissioned agents. We have about 100 FTEs. We're down 10 right now, but that comes after last month we graduated a class of 10. So 2 months ago, the numbers were dramatically different than they are now, but that is still, for an agency as small as we are, that's a dramatic vacancy rate. I do want to say one thing about, so we're down 10 agents right now and 10 scientists. So you'll hear more about recruiting and retention. I don't want to be repetitive. I do want to tell you one thing, though, that I'm particularly proud of. The class that we graduated in December, 10 agents, not a single agent is going to a metro. Nobody's going to Kansas City, Topeka, Wichita. All of those agents are going places like Hugoton, Oxford, Independence, Great Bend, Pittsburgh. They're going to the places where I believe our customers need the most help. And that is a significant change and something that I'm particularly proud of when it comes to how we're allocating resources at the KBI. So with that, I recognize I've run a minute or two over. Thank you all, committee, very much for the opportunity to provide this brief overview to you. And I imagine you have questions when everyone is done, Mr. Chair. Is that the plan?
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that.
Very well. I'll step
Just
aside.
hold your questions till everybody's done. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Colonel Eric Smith, Kansas Highway Patrol, you're up. Thanks for joining us in committee, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Vice Chair, and members of the committee. I appear before you today alongside the KBI and my police chief and sheriff colleagues to speak about the state of law enforcement in Kansas. And you'll hear from them, as you have Director Mativi, about the issues top of mind in this arena. I want to speak to you briefly just about a few of the topics. One may seem somewhat repetitive, the issue of recruitment and retention. But I also want to provide some real-life examples of how that impacts the KHP, and by extension, you and your constituents. The second part of my remarks will just be a brief snapshot of other issues, such as the aging infrastructure, the pay among our non-sworn employees, a couple of technical updates at KHP, and then a sneak peek into our primary legislative agenda. First, with respect to agency staffing, we recognize that this is not just a KHP problem. It's not just a state of Kansas problem. Indeed, it's a nationwide issue, a national issue. What we've elected to do at KHP really in the short term is to focus on those things that we can control. Not a lot that we can do about attitudes towards law enforcement other than toil every day to help change those attitudes. There's not a lot that we can do about work ethic amongst youth. There's not a lot that we can do to compete with the private sector. But there are things with respect to recruiting and retention that we do control. And so that's what we've chosen to focus on again in the short term. So I want to give you a few representations of what the situation is at KHP and what our response has been. First of all, access to lateral applicants that have been certified by the state of Kansas as law enforcement officers. In 2022, we initiated our first condensed or lateral recruit academy. That was successful in 22. In 23, we did a second one, and in December, we graduated, I believe it was 11 in that class. So we're going to replicate that again in 2024. One thing that's different, instead of just limiting eligibility for that to Kansas certified officers, officers that are certified by the commission in a state other than Kansas will accept those as lateral applicants as well. We'd also like to get to a point in our training capacity where we could run a second lateral recruit class each year. We have a regular recruit class at the beginning of the year, one that begins in the summer, and then in the second half of the year, we run that collateral condensed class. We'd like to be able to get to where we can run 4, 2 of each type per year. One of the things that we discovered was when we advertised a vacancy announcement, the job had an open date and it had a close date. And from the point that that position closed until the next one opened, it was impossible for somebody to apply for the patrol. That didn't make sense. It's not logical. And now those positions are open until filled. Another thing that we've begun the process of initiating is for those who are prior certified, they obviously have exceptional skills or certifications that a regular recruit with no law enforcement background would have. And we have the authority to place them into our pay matrix, our career progression plan, at a higher step within the same pay grade. We're going to be looking at options for placing people in a higher step on that pay grade when they come to us from another agency with significant skill or certification. We've also initiated, as a result of the contract that we negotiated with the State Troopers Association, an incentive pay committee. We're looking at options and availability for pay for additional skills and certifications, such as pilot, such as a bilingual trooper, those who have advanced education degrees, and then a shorter-term incentive pays for those who serve as coaches in our academy or field training agents. That currently doesn't exist, so we need to look at those options as well. Another thing that may seem minor in nature, but a uniform committee. This is a very nice uniform. It's a uniform that does a very good job at representing the culture, the history, and the tradition of the Kansas Highway Patrol, but it is not a wash and wear uniform. This uniform that I'm wearing today cost $17 to dry clean. I worked the road yesterday in the snowstorm in Kansas City, and I went through 2 uniforms. A wash and wear uniform that resembles this would be very appropriate for troopers in wherever in Kansas, but particularly those who are out in the heat in August, rolling around doing truck inspections and things of that nature. So we need to expand our thinking in that regard, I think, to some degree. And then finally, the contract that we did negotiate with the Kansas State Troopers Association. In years past, that's a process that could have taken anywhere between 3 months and 18 months. Occasionally, it was contentious, as you well know. When I took office in July, I committed to jump-starting that process and finishing it in 30 days, thanks to the hard work of those on our staff, in particular the new Lieutenant Colonel John Lenher. That contract was negotiated and reached an agreement in principle in 28 days. Why is that important? The overarching theme there is that when our employees are happy and when they feel appreciated, they actually become our best recruiters. And so that's really important in the realm of recruitment and retention. I want to shift gears just a little bit and talk briefly about our aging infrastructure and just mention or highlight for the committee that the governor's proposed budget does include about $7.2 million in maintenance, repairs, and updates to our training academy in Salina. I'm not sure if any of you have been out to that facility. It's a fantastic facility, but it is old. There are stairwells that don't exist anymore. There are pipes that are lead and broken. Asbestos has been removed, but technologically, it doesn't even meet standards of most elementary schools today, let alone adult learning facilities. And then finally, a $10 million recommendation for a new statewide communications center in Salina. The one that exists also on the same campus at the training center is very small. It has limited power backup, data backup, data redundancy, and frankly, it would not withstand a major storm. And that would be devastating to public safety and to recovery efforts. I talked a little bit about pay for our non-sworn employees. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about pay for the troopers. As you noted from the governor's budget and from her State of the State, she proposed raising the lowest pay rate among state employees to $15 an hour. And anecdotally, I've heard that there was approximately 1,000 state of Kansas employees who made less than $15 an hour. I ran some quick numbers at KHP. We had 6 at the KHP that made less than $15 per hour. That may not sound like a large number, but for folks who have been with our agency, often for many, many years, they would see an immediate raise. And I think for what we ask of our folks, in fact, what you ask and what your constituents ask and expect from our folks, in any particular job series or classification, that's actually a shame. We expect them to be professional career servants, yet we pay them less than a high school part-time job. I know this might sound controversial at times, but we get what we pay for. And for high-quality services, it costs what it costs. Switch gears just a little bit to some upgrades to our data and technology capacity. A couple things I just wanted to highlight. We're working with the Department of Administration and an app developer internally to develop a scheduling system for VIN inspections. Currently, in many places, you can schedule your license plate renewal or your driver's license renewal online and in advance. You can't do that with a motor vehicle inspection to title a car that is transferred from out of state. We should be able to do that. We're working, again, internally with the developer to be able to initiate and establish that statewide this fiscal year that we're in now. Also, it might surprise many of you to know that the Kansas Highway Patrol has 0 body-worn cameras in use. Not acceptable. It's not acceptable to me. It should not be acceptable to you. All of our patrol cars have dash cams. We don't have body cams. The governor's budget recommends $2 million. That is a no strings attached match, a match to a $2 million Department of Justice grant that we're seeking for another $2 million. But if we're not successful in obtaining that grant, we would still ask for support amongst the legislature to fund that $2 million, perhaps more, if the DOJ grant doesn't come through. But we feel it's essential, not only for transparency, but for evidentiary purposes, to protect the state, to protect the troopers, to protect the agency, and to protect the public, to outfit all of our sworn officers with body-worn cameras. And then I'll wrap up with just 2 points on our legislative agenda. We are actively seeking legislative sponsorship on 2 fronts. Number one, an excessive speeding bill. In the House, I think last session, there was an excessive speeding bill that did not make it out of committee, but just by the numbers to represent what I'm talking about here, over the last 4 years, so this is 2020 through 2023, the Kansas Highway Patrol issued citations for approximately 250,000 citations, 250,000 citations for any speed violation. For 20 miles an hour or more, 60,000. For speeding violations in excess of 100 miles per hour, 12,000. Average about 3,000 a year on the Kansas highways for speeding in excess of 100 miles an hour. It's not acceptable. We shouldn't accept it, you shouldn't accept it, and your constituents should not be exposed to that type of danger. This is not a focus of legislation, but I did want to point out that in 2023, ending last month, 351 crashes, fatality crashes that resulted in 384 deaths. Every one of those were preventable. And to the extent speed was a contributing factor, excessive speed legislation is essential, and we've got to push that across the finish line this year. The other thing that we're going to ask for as an agency is a fix to the ignition interlock fee structure. There was a bill, I believe, in 2022 that passed that moved the function of ignition interlock from Department of Revenue over to the Highway Patrol. It also imposed a fee that the vendor could collect for the sale or the availability of those ignition interlocks. The Attorney General's office has issued an opinion that the language is such that we are not allowed to collect a fee for monitoring after installation. So we're going to ask for a fix to that legislation that specifically authorizes the vendor to collect a continuous monitoring and a maintenance fee for the purposes of compliance with that ignition interlock device. So those are the points that I wanted to bring to the attention of the committee today. I thank you for your time and attention, and I'll be available at the end for any questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Colonel. Yeah, when I saw that in the governor's budget, I was blown away that you guys didn't have body cameras. Had no idea. All right, thank you very much. Now we're pleased to hear from Sheriff Jeff Easter, Sedgwick County Legislative Committee Chair, Kansas Sheriff's Association. Sheriff, thanks for being here with us today.
Good afternoon, everyone. Appreciate the time that you're giving us today. We do, all 3 associations appreciated what you did last year and are very much appreciative that we're doing that again this year. So I'm Jeff Easter with the Kansas Sheriff's Association. One of the things that I want to start off with, because I don't think at times, I know I get questions, and I'm sure you do too, but I get questions, what does that legislative folks actually accomplish up there in Topeka? Well, I'm here to tell you, you accomplished 15 things for law enforcement last year, and I don't think you realize how much you did. And so you approved funding for the South Central Kansas Mental Health Facility, which I'll talk about a little bit more in depth later on. Established reimbursement for local costs associated with wait times for admission to the state. Programs for mental health commitments and competency evaluations and treatment. Passed legislation to make the Juvenile Crisis Intervention Centers a reality. Expanded the Deferred Retirement Options Program for local KPNF agencies. Enhanced sentencing for manufacturing illegal drugs containing fentanyl. Now, one of the things that we're going to ask for this year, that was for manufacturing. We're going to ask the same for distributing that same drug. Clarified the pressing illegal drugs, pressing illegal drugs into imitation prescription drugs as an act of illegal distribution. Expanded drug treatment options for persons convicted of a wider list of crimes. Passed modifications to the interference of law enforcement officer to recognize the higher risk to the public and to the officers when fleeing from a lawful detention or arrest. Passed stronger laws for felons prohibited from possessing a firearm, committing new crimes with a firearm. Passed a new law to help us better vet law enforcement applicants who have applied to multiple law enforcement agencies. Updated the jail statutes that hadn't been amended for over 100 years. Made some adjustments to the Juvenile Offender Act to correct gaps in holding juvenile offenders accountable to complete their treatment programs. clarified the use of tracking devices to determine the location of a person with a protection order is a violation of that order, kept the Scrap Metal Act alive by extending the sunset and clarifying the law relating to stolen catalytic converters, and added Kansas and wildlife law enforcement officers to eligibility to the KP&F retirement system. So that's a lot, and most of that came through this committee. So we appreciate everything that you did last year, and I think part of it is because of these meetings that we have prior. Now, with that said, we still have mental health concerns. We still see media reports and hear some legislators talk about people held in jails without criminal charges while waiting on the waiting list for the state hospital bed. That is not accurate. By law, we can't do that. And so what happens is a lot of times in the smaller jurisdictions, they have deputies that are sitting there 24 hours a day with the mental health person in an office, at a sheriff's office, or sitting in a hotel room with them. And that still occurs to this day. So that's still an issue. Secondly, waiting lists for emergency commitments are getting longer and wait times are not significantly improving. In November 2021, there was 155 people on the waiting list for involuntary admissions to state hospitals with an average wait time of 82 hours at Osawatomie and 29 hours at Larned. In November 2023, there were 191 people on the waiting list with an average wait time of 70 hours at Osawatomie and 40 hours at Larned. People on a waiting list require significant personal resources to monitor them while we wait for a bed at a state hospital, and I discussed earlier what some of those resources are. The other issue is the competency evaluations and the restoration. And so those times have gone up as well. I know KDADS is trying to do those mobile competency type evaluations. They're not doing that many. They are trying. I understand that they're short personnel. So this is all leading to what we're discussing constantly on mental health. I will tell you from a personal note, we have 27 people in Sedgwick County that are on one of the waiting lists, whether it's to be evaluated or for treatment, one of which has been on there for 471 days simply for treatment. This particular individual we're getting sued over because he beat the heck out of another prisoner after he'd been on 23-hour lockdown for a while. We step him back down. He levels out a little bit, and he broke an arm and a jaw of one of my deputies. He no longer gets out. He's in there 23 hours a day, locked in his cell, and he gets out 1 hour a day with nobody else out. Now, what do you think the ACLU thinks of that? They don't think highly of it. But that's the predicament we're in because this person needs to be at a hospital being treated. And so that's just one of many stories that a lot of sheriffs have. The good news is that this legislative body had agreed to build a mental health hospital in the Wichita-Sedgwick County area. That is going forward. I sat on the board for that, the building of the hospital, the location, all that kind of stuff. But here's what I'll tell you is we had 2 representatives and a state senator who want to increase that bed amount from 50 to 100. So they're going to come back asking for more funding for that. The board in general agreed with that. But why that's so important, whether it's 50 beds or 100 beds, is that catchment area. Because with between 20 and 30% of the patients that go to Osawatomie or Larned for either involuntary or for treatment and evaluation come from Sedgwick County. So that's why it was important to get that done down there. So there is a fix in place. The problem is the deadline on that is December 31st of 2026. So we're going to have almost 2 years of still this going on. So what can be done in the meantime to relieve some of that? What I think is going to be very important and what I've talked about on the board is that catchment area. Because at 50 beds, catchment area looks like this. At 100 beds, that catchment area grows, which then relieves Osawatomie and Larned, which then helps out the rest of the communities in the state of Kansas. And so I know that's going to be a big ask to increase that to 100 beds money-wise. But I know that there's a couple of representatives and a senator that's going to try to introduce more funding for that. But in the end, it's a better service for the rest of the state, in my opinion, because then you significantly will cut down those wait times for everybody else. Again, what's important about that, and what I'm pushing the board to do, is really look at that catchment area. Does that catchment area go to Salina to the Oklahoma border, down to Pittsburgh, and out to Pratt, if it's 100 beds? If that's the catchment area, and that's fictional, I'm not saying that's what we've discussed, but can you imagine how much bed space that frees up for everybody else? It's quite a bit. And so I'll end there and let one of my other colleagues come up and speak. If you have any questions later, I'll be happy to stand for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sheriff. All right, we now have Lieutenant Tim Greenwood from the Hayes Police Department, representing the Kansas Peace Officers Association. Lieutenant, thanks for making the trip.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and all of your time listening to our needs in law enforcement across the state. I'm going to focus on recruitment, retention, and training. And to be candid, our profession is struggling. When myself and most of the members of law enforcement here started this profession 25 plus years ago, we had literally dozens, up to 100 applicants for one open position on departments. We don't have that anymore. Currently, many metro agencies are down 15 to 18% in staffing. Rural agencies have gone over a year without any qualified applicants. I spoke with the chief of police earlier this week, who out of his 6-person department, he was down 3 spots months ago and went over a year without applications. It's something that we're just struggling with across the state and nationally. Shortages are detrimental to all agencies, but they hit the smaller agencies the most. And we have to remember here in the state of Kansas, half the agencies have 5 or fewer officers. 70% of Kansas agencies have 10 or fewer. In order for those agencies to get through these shortages, they're having to cut services. Additionally, it's a terrible strain on the officers staying in the position and responding to calls. These officers are having to work extra shifts. Their caseloads are increasing exponentially. They're losing vacation time. They're losing sick time. In rural areas especially, there's extra risk associated. We find ourselves working cases where we have one officer dealing with multiple suspects because backup's no longer available because there's not a shift partner. Fatigue is causing mistakes and weakening resolve. Fortunately, we're unable to get some quality training because in order to travel to training, for example, a 40-hour crisis intervention training or even a 4-hour defensive tactics training, somebody has to be in our community to take the calls to respond to emergencies. So we're suffering there as well. Agencies continue to support each other, especially in times of emergency. We're professional organizations, and emergency management is what we do. You will see troopers coming into town to help local police officers in disturbances. You'll see police officers responding to the county to back up deputies. But it's the day in and day out call volume that is crushing morale. As you heard earlier, agencies are also competing for the same applicant pool, and the applicants are far fewer than ever before. Today's applicant is typically looking for a 2 to 3 year job before they're willing to move on. And law enforcement, our first year is dedicated to training. Typically, a new officer will go to 14 weeks of basic training at the Kansas Law Enforcement Training Center. They typically will go back to their resident agency and spend another 14 weeks training with a senior officer before they're able to go out on their own. And for the first year, they're constantly on the phone and constantly checking in because it is a dynamic position. And often it takes up to 2 years for an officer to be competent to be out there trusted alone. Applicants today are looking and are selective for pay, benefits, retirement options, insurance availability, equipment condition, and training, opportunities for training. Historically, you all have supported us very well, and we appreciate that. For example, as you heard, you extended the DROP program to all Kansas police and fire agencies. That's a huge recruiting tool. You also passed a law to help us better vet applicants of multiple agencies, so we could vet those officers going from agency to agency, often avoiding discipline. Your future support is needed. It's crucial. The first and foremost absolute need is solid and dependable funding for the Kansas Law Enforcement Training Center. You may recall that currently the KLETC is funded based off court fees and license tag fees. They've been stagnant for 7 years trying to deal with the increased need for what their positions do and what their agency does or their entity does. If not fixed, KLETC is going to have to cut services, simply put. Not just basic training, KLETC, they also perform or conduct very valuable and quality in-service training for all levels, line level officers, supervisors, and even administrators. They've pushed out regional training sites in Dodge City, Parsons, and Hayes. This enables those smaller agencies to not have to travel all the way to Yoder near Hutchinson to attend that 8-hour training course. They can do it closer to home and closer to their communities. Recently, they stood up the Kansas Law Enforcement Accreditation Program. Like most accreditation programs, this is a structured process which ensures agencies are meeting standards and following best practices in law enforcement. They've been able to do this at a fraction of the cost of other accreditation sources. Currently, there's a bill to fund KLETC through the general fund, House Bill 2491. We strongly support that passage and hope for your support in it as well. We also ask that you examine the disparity in retirement plans. Support agencies' participation in KPNF. For those agencies that simply cannot afford it and or do not qualify for KPNF, please continue the CAPERS Tier 2 support. CAPERS Tier 3 is simply inadequate. It's dependent upon the market and interest rates. Lastly, we ask that you deny well-meaning training requirements for agencies and officers. These requirements are often politically motivated, and agencies need the flexibility to address the urgent needs in their communities. It encumbers agencies with logistical and financial burdens, and we need empowered as department heads and administrators to use our experience to build our professional leaders, to develop our personnel, and grow our organizations for what our community needs, not what somebody believes is a political necessity. I thank you again for the opportunity to discuss those issues with you, and like the others, I'll be sticking around for questions.
Thank you very much, Lieutenant. And just a quick follow-up on that bill that was introduced. That was a recommendation by the Joint Committee on Corrections Oversight during the interim to move KLETC from being fee-funded to being general fund funded. That was introduced, I think, just day before yesterday, and will be heard in appropriations, and seems to have some pretty good support there. So, all right. Originally, Chief Darrell Atterbury was going to be joining us, but as he drove up here, he started feeling ill and decided not to come get us all sick. So we appreciate that, although we miss him, and we'll welcome Ed Klump to share the thoughts on behalf of Chief Atterbury.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I'm not Darrell Atterbury, so you're stuck with me because he got ill on the way up here. He decided that rather than, it wouldn't be a good idea to exchange spreading information with you with spreading bugs with you, so here we are. A few things that I want to talk about. I am Ed Klump. I, as you know, am the lobbyist for the Kansas Sheriff's Association, Kansas Association of Chiefs of Police, and the Kansas Peace Officers Association. So this testimony is on behalf of the Chiefs Association. One of the first things I want to talk about is the fentanyl concerns, and Director Mattivi already went into a lot of detail on the levels of those concerns and what's going on statewide. I want to talk to you about that from a local perspective. there are many, many things that have to be done to address this fentanyl issue. I've heard Director Mativi many times say we can't arrest ourselves out of the fentanyl problem, and that is absolutely true. But we do need to have the tools to arrest the people who are perpetuating that problem. And so that's one of the things we need. In our communities, when we're looking at the local level, yes, we are concerned about the people who are bringing those drugs into our community and giving them to the low-level distributors who are handling to the people that are actually taking those pills and dying from the fentanyl. It is those low-level dealers that we see most often inside our cities. And yes, the big ones come in too, especially in your major metro areas. But we need the tools to deal with those people. And we also need the legislative support for all those other support factors that need to happen if we're truly going to handle this fentanyl crisis. And so some of those are. I'm going to talk first about our local needs and enforcement, and we need to keep all the tools we got, and that includes civil asset forfeiture. And we recognize that there will be a bill coming this year, not sure from where, but there will be a bill coming this year to readdress the civil asset forfeiture that was presented last year and was referred to the Judicial Council for study. That Judicial Council study has been prepared, and we would ask you to look at that closely. There are certainly things in that recommendations that, you know, we probably aren't tickled pink with, but at the same time, there's things those are things I think we can live with and make the system much more acceptable. And so I urge you to look closely at that report and really consider. There was a lot of work went into that. Director Mativi was on that committee. I was on that committee, several others. And it was, in fact, Representative Mon was on that committee. I'm trying to think if anybody else in here. I think that was it. You were, weren't you, Chair? How could I forget that? And so, you know, there was a lot of good discussion there. There was a lot of hours went into that. And I think the recommendations that come out of that committee certainly bear high attention as you work that bill this year. And I'm sure there'll be one coming. But it takes more than that. It was already mentioned that we're going to be bringing a bill to add some sentencing enhancements for the distribution of drugs. We want to frame that in a way that we're talking about the higher level distributions, not the lowest level of severity for the distributors, because those tend to grab those people that, yes, they are distributing drugs, but it's not your everyday distributor. It's the ones that are, you know, they buy a batch of pills and they take them to a party and they start sharing them with people. We want to go after the ones above that. Those people need help. They're probably already addicted. But anyway, we want to enhance those sentences for the significant drug dealers that are out there. Education. We need to educate the public better. We need to put a lot of energy into that, and there's a lot of energy already going into that. We have to educate people not only the hazards of taking these drugs, but we need to educate parents and kids about how do they help each other. How do you find help for your child when you think they're becoming addicted on drugs? And that leads to the next problem, which is the inadequate supply of treatment available for people that are suffering from addictions. I have had several calls from frustrated law enforcement officials around this state who have a juvenile that has an addiction and they can't find a place for that juvenile to go to get treated. Every place is full. And yeah, we can get them into treatment maybe 2 months from now, maybe 6 weeks from now. And that's too long. And we need to address that. There is just a lot that needs to be done if we're going to truly address the fentanyl problem. We're also always concerned about protecting the public from known offenders, and this is a continuing problem. Last year in the juvenile system, this committee heard a bill, took action on it that made a few adjustments in the juvenile system that was amended several years back. And we appreciate that. We think those have been some good amendments. I understand there's another one in the works. I think it's House Bill 2490 that wants to take a look at that too. That's a recommendation of the interim committee. And we ask you to really take a good look at that. One of the problems that we have had consistently, and this is probably more in the metro areas than other places, but we don't have the right tools in the toolbox right now to take care of that very small percentage of juvenile offenders who are not just violent offenders, but they're repeat offenders over and over and over again. And those are the kind of gaps we're trying to fill right now. What we've got to do is we've got to be very, very cautious that we don't take a step backwards, though, from the improvements, the vast improvements that we have made in those juvenile programs that are doing the right thing for 98% of the kids. We can't go backwards and have it affect that the way we were before the adjustments to those juvenile laws happened 5-6 years ago. It was atrocious, the number of juveniles we were holding in facilities for a long length of time on minor violations. That's gone now. It's working, but the part that's not working is that very small percent of the problem offenders. Firearms are still a major issue. Last year, you approved the bill the legislature did that enhanced the sentences for persons who were prohibited from possessing a firearm because of criminal activity, and yet they go out and still commit new crimes with a firearm. And that was a huge step, and we think that's going to bear fruit. We won't see the benefits of that until we get some people through the system and convicted on those to see if that's going to have the effect. We still see a lot of firearms, a large number of firearms being present in drug transactions. And that is a huge problem. That's a huge problem for officer safety. It's a huge problem for everyone. We read reports way too often about innocent bystanders, oftentimes children, that are shot, killed, or wounded by a stray bullet, not intended for them, but when somebody doing a drug deal pulls it out and starts shooting. And we've just got to find a way to crack down on that problem. There was a bill last year. I think it got out of committee, if I remember right. I don't remember which chamber, but it didn't get above the line that asked for some sentencing enhancements for when a firearm was present during the drug transaction. We'd ask you to look at that again. I'm sure this testimony isn't as robust as Chief Atterbury would have provided. I know he had a lot of data he had pulled together and things that he wanted to share with you that I don't have with me. But I think that hits the primary spots. And like the others, I want to thank you so much for allowing us to come in and give this presentation. We think that this has been a great addition. I wish some more committees would pick it up. I'd like to get in front of the judiciary committees and do the same thing, because it is so important for you to understand the challenges that Kansas law enforcement meets at all levels, state level, local level. And I'd like for you to hear from us how we're not just interested in making sentences stronger. Yes, we want some of that. We also are interested in how do we work together to enhance the education opportunities, to enhance the treatment opportunities, and things like that. Treatment is the only way we're going to get out of this. Education. It's the only way we keep people from getting addicted in the first place. And unfortunately, in the end, those that don't heed the warning, we still have to have strong laws to take those off the street that are handing this poison to our kids. We're finding these fentanyl-laced pills and candies and whatever in the grade schools, in the junior highs, in the high schools. It's just totally unacceptable, and that's got to change. We appreciate all of your support. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll stand for questions when it's appropriate.
Thank you very much, Ed. I've got a couple questions, and then we'll turn to the committee. Director Mattivi, if you would, please. We know that we've done some things legislatively as it relates to fentanyl. Is there anything else that we can do as a legislature to help fight the fentanyl epidemic?
We need the statutory fix that one of my colleagues was talking about. I have the details right here at the tip of my fingers. This really is going to require a whole of society approach. I can stand here for an hour and talk to you about our targeted enforcement efforts and things that we at the KBI are doing to address fentanyl trafficking into and through the state with our partners at the Highway Patrol, our partners in local law enforcement, and our federal partners as well. But Ed is exactly right. Education is key. I accept every single invitation that I get to go talk to a community forum, a roundtable. When we're done here, I'm headed to Hays. And tomorrow morning, I'm talking to every middle school student and every high school student in Hays, Kansas about fentanyl. We really need to be spreading the word. What's happening at the border isn't doing us any favors because we know that's how all of the fentanyl is getting here. We know that this is no longer an issue with Chinese companies importing it into the United States like it was years ago. We know that as soon as the cartels realized that this was the most profitable drug society has ever seen, they elbowed the Chinese out of the way, and this is now a cartel-driven product. I apologize for repeating myself, but you can't overstate the level of profit motive and profit-driven activity that's going on with this drug. And that's why we need the ability to go after the organizations. We have to have every tool available to us to go after organizations. And then finally, we've got to decrease the demand. And unfortunately, I only see two ways to do it. I mean, number one, we can educate people so they don't take it anymore, or we can let enough people take it and enough people die that there just aren't any people out there left that want it, right? And unfortunately, that's the trajectory right now, and we have to do something to interrupt that. So I know it wasn't a very specific answer, Mr. Chair, but as you go through this session, if I could beg of all of you to keep in mind that this has to be a whole of society approach. And I'm not here just asking for more enforcement resources, although we desperately need those. We need more education. We need more public awareness. We need to shut off the supply and to decrease the demand.
Thank you very much for that. One last question for me anyway. Any update on our white powder letter perpetrators?
Sure. So one of the most difficult decisions that I have had to make in my just over a year as KBI Director was handing that investigation over to our federal partners. So we're not working on it as actively as I would like. I have been given a glimpse behind the curtain, and I can tell you that our federal partners are working the case very aggressively. They're doing everything that I, as a former federal prosecutor, would want them to be doing. They're leaving no stone unturned. So I am very optimistic. There are a lot of clues in what's happened. They're looking in all the right places. But for me to make any more comment beyond that, I really shouldn't do in any sort of public forum other than assure you that the case is being worked in a very aggressive manner. And if you knew of the details, you'd be very pleased with what's happening.
Very good. We'll take your word on that. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Additional questions for any members of the committee? Representative Butler.
This is for Director Mattivi. Last year at a LEO dinner, I had asked a question in an open forum there about the use of fentanyl strips, and there was some apprehension, I think a little bit, not maybe pushback or apprehension from the police there. I think it was with sheriff, maybe, I can't remember if it was chief of police as well. And you made a good statement about that if it provides one more day for someone, that's a good thing. But I'm wondering if some of that apprehension has gone away now, or is it still a battle that's going on, people saying we shouldn't use it or should use it?
So I'm not aware of a battle going on right now, Representative Butler, with regard to fentanyl test strips. I mean, they're no longer considered drug paraphernalia. They're out there. When I was confirmed, I promised to this body that I would be objective and data-driven in my analysis of criminal justice issues. We don't have any data that I'm aware of with regard to the effectiveness of criminal test strips. Instinctively, I think anything that we can do to help save a life is worthwhile. I don't view them as like handing a needle to an addict. I really don't. I equate them more toward Narcan. And I'd be happy to talk with you for a moment about Narcan if you'll let me. I think Narcan availability is something that we really need to pursue with regard to combating the fentanyl problem. And perhaps I should have mentioned this, Mr. Chair, in response to your question. I am an advocate for increased Narcan availability. I have an ampule in my briefcase, I have an ampule in my work car, I have an ampule in my personal car. I think we ought to have Narcan available in every AED that is set up around this building in our state and in our country. I think that would be a good thing. We have an agent who is a Narcan save. He suffered a transdermal exposure during an undercover buy, and by the time his rescue team moved in, he was unconscious and unresponsive. He was pulled out of the vehicle, administered Narcan, and is back on the streets in our communities every single night, doing valuable work. I have heard people, to go directly to your question, sir, I have heard people that oppose the availability of Narcan because of something that we've learned of called Narcan parties. And it's a really disturbing thing, right? You have a group of people that's using fentanyl. They have one person stand aside basically as the equivalent of a designated driver. They have the Narcan, and if somebody overdoses, the Narcan's administered by the designated driver, if you will, and we know that 30 minutes later, these people are back using fentanyl, right? That's really troubling. But like I tell my kids, every good thing in society can be turned and used for a bad purpose, right? When it comes to Narcan, we have an agent who is alive today because of it. We know that it saves lives. Right now, the Narcan save ratio in Kansas is about 2 to 1. Roughly 2 Narcan saves for every Narcan overdose fatality. That means the roughly 500 fatalities we had in Kansas last year would have been about 1,500 without Narcan. So I don't view this as a political issue. I don't know if there are people on either side of it, but I can tell you from my chair, I am a vocal supporter of widespread availability of Narcan. So, and that's more what I equate fentanyl test strips with than anything else. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much. Did you have something, Ed? Yeah, just step in front of the mic for me.
Ed Klump with the associations. Representative Butler, I want to expand a little bit on the fentanyl test strip question. Our position from our 3 associations was absolutely, we didn't oppose it. We absolutely didn't support it. And part of that reason was what Director Mativi just said. There really wasn't what we thought was a good study indicating that it was that advantageous, but there certainly wasn't any studies out there that said it wasn't. One study that got cited most often was from back in the Northeast, and it was very limited. It brought in a bunch of people that were addicted, and they paid them to participate in this program. And one of the things, if you look at that study and you follow some of the follow-up reports to that study, was that the question came up, what did people do when they tested their illegal drugs and it was positive for fentanyl? What did they do with that fentanyl? And it found about half of them threw the drugs away. Guess what? The other half did it. They sold them to somebody else or gave them to somebody else. They didn't dispose of them. They gave that, what they knew to have fentanyl in them, to somebody else. And so those were the reasons we didn't support it, but we certainly didn't want to stand in the way of it at the same time, because it does kind of make sense. And those were the analysis we made of it when we talked about it in each one of our association's meetings. It was overwhelming that we should just stay neutral on it, not support it or not oppose it. So I just wanted to clarify that that was at least the position of our associations. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Representative Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I'll start with Lieutenant Greenwood. I'm most interested just because of the profile of Hayes with the college community there as well. What age group would you say is most at risk for unintentional fentanyl overdose?
I would have to defer that to probably the KBI, who has the statistics. I'd be shooting from the hips, or
just your experience where you've run into the most.
My experience is probably low to mid-20s, but again, we've seen it as referred to at all levels. Thank you.
Thank you. Additional questions for members? Representative Turk, and then we'll do Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've got 2 questions. Start with Mr. Mativi, please. First of all, thank you. It's great testimony. It's good stuff.
Thank you, sir.
You mentioned swatting, and I was just curious what the vetting process is prior to an agency taking action. in any situation that may result in a swatting.
So swatting, the term derives from back in the day when gamers used to use this technique to exact revenge against other gamers that they got angry with, or even to interrupt another gamer from playing, right? They would call 911, report some sort of violent incident at that other gamer's house to get a SWAT team to respond. We had a very high-profile one here in Kansas, down in Wichita. A young man was killed. That's where the name swatting comes from. That's not what we're seeing anymore. What we're seeing anymore are fairly sophisticated actors overseas placing calls from voice-over internet numbers to response centers or dispatch centers in Kansas and other states reporting violent events in certain locations. For example, when we saw the national wave, the victim locally was Senator Marshall. And the Stafford County 911 Center received a phone call saying that there was a hostage event taking place at a rural property that they knew belonged to Senator Marshall. When you have a report like that, you have to dispatch someone, right? You can't not treat that seriously, but at the same time, we try to consider it in context with whatever else is happening around the state and around the country at the same time. So I'll give you another example. We had a call last winter of an active shooter at Highland Park High School here in Topeka. I was sitting in the optometrist chair at my optometrist's office about 2 miles away from Highland Park High School. By the time I got into the area, there were more than 75 law enforcement officials or vehicles in the area. But within about the first 3 minutes of that call, we got reports that, oh, wait a minute, there had been 2 similar calls in Lawrence just that morning. And within the time period immediately after, similar calls were starting to come in other locations in Kansas, right? So at that point, you don't call off the response until you've confirmed that there's not an active shooter at the location, but the picture is developing, right? So as far as a vetting process, you have to take the call seriously at the time, but then you put it into context based on other information that's coming in simultaneously. Does that help answer your question?
Perfect. And the scenario for which you opened with was exactly what was in my mind when I was waiting for your answer. That's what I was hoping to find out. What was learned from that situation with the young man? What has changed from that point till today? Sounds like broader communication across agencies.
That's something that we strive for every day, right? I mean, not just with regard to these calls, but every single day. And we have the NLET system and other systems out there that help us communicate across law enforcement to provide this information to other agencies when it's going on. But yeah, the first bomb threat that we got at a Kansas hospital during that wave of swatting events was taken very seriously. By the time you get to the 5th or 6th one, an identical type of call, your response changes.
Right? Yeah, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Representative Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wish I had time to visit with all of you in detail, and I know Representative Ressman still has, I believe, some good questions yet this afternoon. Let me first address a general comment to both the superintendent and the director. I'm really glad both of you are here. I seldom compliment our Attorney General, but in the case of the appointment of our director, I've done so publicly, and I will do so again here today. And I often compliment our governor, and I'm pleased to do that again here today. I'm pleased that people like both of you were willing to come and direct these agencies in Kansas, particularly you, Superintendent, under somewhat difficult circumstances. Those preliminary matters being said, Director Matavi, I do not want you to speak to pending investigations, and I know that you won't. You're a fine lawyer, former prosecutor of distinction. But I would like to know, how does the interagency cooperation agreement work when it does become necessary to call in an out-of-state law enforcement agency to conduct investigations in Kansas, particularly where your agency might be somehow the subject of the investigation? Is there a memorandum of agreement Do we pay out-of-state agencies? Do they report to the local prosecutor? Just kind of help me understand how the process works, again, without addressing any specific circumstance. Because I didn't know about this before.
Sure, let's say hypothetically speaking that our agency, for example, had an allegation of a conflict of interest in a particular investigation. I would probably reach out to one of my counterparts in another state and ask that agency to come in and assume control of the investigation. Once that agency agreed, there would be a letter of understanding exchanged. But once the other agency comes in, our agency has no longer has anything to do with the investigation. It's totally conducted by the outside investigation, by the outside agency. We do that for other states, and other states do that for us. I can tell you right now, we're doing one for Colorado, and Colorado's doing one for us. They don't bill us, we don't pay them, and vice versa.
In this hypothetical situation, when an out-of-state Bureau of Investigation officer comes into Kansas, are they appointed as special agents so that they have the protections as well as the responsibilities of a Kansas law enforcement officer?
They are, not just in theory, but in reality.
Right.
The person is typically sworn in. In one case I can think of, it was the Attorney General who swore that in as a Kansas agent for the temporary and limited purpose of conducting that investigation.
And to wrap this line of inquiry up, then does that out-of-state agency report to the local prosecutor, the Attorney General, or does it come back through your agency? Do they report to you at all? Help me understand.
They report to an independent prosecutor that's typically been appointed by the local prosecutor.
Very good. I appreciate that. Mr. Chair, with your leave, I'd like to inquire of the superintendent quickly.
Certainly.
Thank you. My question for you, Superintendent, is equally applicable to the director, but I want to give you your chance. I hear Lieutenant Greenwood express concern, and it's always been a concern, that the Highway Patrol and the KBI are known to be places where local law enforcement officers someday aspire to work. We've improved the pay. We've improved, I hope, the benefits for your officers. How do we deal, though, with Lieutenant Greenwood's concern that transfer academies facilitate poaching? How do I balance what, well, Sheriff Eastwood, his men and women are about to get a big raise, I understand, but I'd use him as my example otherwise. But how do we deal with that? How do we balance that circumstance in a responsible way?
Good question. Thank you for that. First of all, I think that my obligation to the Highway Patrol is to create an environment and a set of circumstances, employment opportunity circumstances, that best advocate for my agency. So to the extent I create an environment that is competitive and that would tend to draw people from other agencies, that does represent a certain unfortunate situation. But what I will say, and what I can say with quite certainty, based on the last two graduating classes of lateral recruits, we've internally made a commitment to the chiefs and to the sheriffs for whose employees we may poach, as you put it. And that is, we'll return those troopers to those communities. I'm not going to take an officer from Hays who wants to return to Ellis County or to Hays and put them in Labette County or in Southwest Kansas or in Kansas City. If they come from an agency from whom they have a connection with a particular community and they want to serve the Highway Patrol back in that community, we'll honor that and we'll send them back to that community.
And that may in fact aid in recruitment and retention as well. And that goes back to some long-standing policies in the patrol about rotating troopers, which I think we're moving away from. I would mention, however, that I somewhat disagree with your assessment of the quality, not the quality of the training, but the quality of the physical structure at the academy in Salina as it relates to recruiting officers or troopers. You may well have trained at the Wichita-Sedgwick County Training Center when it was sort of like what you've got in Salina. And then I've got Sheriff Easter over here who can sell his recruits on a beautiful new facility at Wichita State. And then we have the situation at KLETC, which is an outstanding academy, at least, well, in all respects. So the question is, are you impeded by the conditions that we have at the old Marymount campus, I think it is, if I recall correctly? Is this a real problem? What do we need to do? What kind of resources and money do we need to bring you, if any?
So the $7.2 million in upgrades that we've asked is not to reconstitute a physical facility like KLETC or like the Wichita Sedgwick County Law Enforcement Training Center. Those are both fantastic, beautiful, well-functioning, well-designed facilities for which we may be a little bit envious. But what I can tell you is that the campus in Salina, as a general infrastructure, does suit our needs. The $7.2 million is to fix, again, aging infrastructure, to make it ADA compliant, for example, to bring technology into the classroom that would match what they have in Hutchinson, in Yoder, or in Wichita. We're just not there yet. So the facility itself, as a shell, is a good facility for the Highway Patrol. It's just the guts need retooled, if you will.
Yeah, well, I certainly hope we can find a way to do that. Final question with the chair's leave. In, I think it was this month's Kansas Trooper magazine, you prepared a letter to the troops, as has been the custom. And I appreciate so much of what you said in that letter, and I'm so happy that you were able to get a memorandum agreement with the Troopers Association. As you know, there has been difficulty in the past, but the relationship between the brass and some troopers. And so I'm really glad that you were able to get to a contract quickly. But specifically, one of the things you mentioned was improving, if you will, the career track for Capitol Police officers. There was a time when they really weren't eligible for promotion beyond Troop K, is it? And I don't know if that's been repaired. I think they've achieved pay equity, but you also talked about the importance that this is a specialization, not only executive protection, but also the physical security of a building like this. Could you address for us what your plans, goals, hopes, and aspirations are in that regard?
I actually have an entire presentation on that topic prepared for House Transportation tomorrow morning, but I'll touch on it briefly, if I could. First of all, to your first point with the issue of career progression and promotion, one of the things that I did late last summer or early in the fall was to extract a career trooper at the rank of captain. Historically, Capitol Police, Police Officer 1, 2, and 3, which is up through the rank of lieutenant, answered to a chain of command at the captain level and higher that were troopers. What I felt after learning what I could in a short amount of time about the structure and the purpose of Capitol Police is that I felt they should have their opportunity for their own leadership. And so when that captain was placed in a different assignment, which is now within the same bureau over at Homeland Security, when that position was vacated, we created the position of LEO 4, Law Enforcement Officer 4, which on the pay matrix is the equivalent of a Highway Patrol captain. So just, I think at the end of December, within the last couple of weeks, Lieutenant Brandon Bixel, who's a Troop K lieutenant, was promoted internally to the rank of captain. So now Capitol Police officers have the opportunity and the ability to aspire to leadership within that troop. That troop, as well as Homeland Security Emergency Operations and Dignitary Protection, are now in what, under a new organizational structure, is called the Protective Services Bureau. So the Protective Services Bureau is led by a Highway Patrol Major, Brett Johnson, who was the former captain of the Governor's Security Detail. He's the Executive Bureau Commander of Protective Services, and Protective Services encapsulates Capitol Police, Homeland Security and Emergency Operations, and Dignitary Protection. The reason why those entities within the patrol were isolated and specialized is because of the uniqueness of their mission. Their mission is not the same as those on the road who are promoting traffic safety, who are inspecting motor carriers, who are involved in the educational forum. Their mission is very specific and is very unique, and they need to be led with organizational leadership that has that in mind. And so to that end, late last fall, I began making my rounds with legislative leadership, the chairman included, and started talking about the plan to reorganize the agency with that in mind, and with that specific discipline. So why is that important to Troop K, to Capitol Police? Because they should not be focused on their CVSA certification that they got in the academy. They should not be focused on the need to maintain a commercial vehicle safety inspection by being out on I-70. They belong in the Capitol area complex. Their priority and their mission should be the safety of the legislators, of the executive branch whose footprint sits in the Capitol area complex. They should be focused on visitor screening. They should be focused on patrol and perimeter around the Capitol area complex. And there are a lot of things that they can do from a specialty perspective in that regard. There are no hazardous device detection canines in Capitol Police. But what did we see last week or the week before? The need to pull all of them in and sweep the Capitol because of the bomb threats. Somebody could drive a vehicle onto this property, and that entity should be able and should be prepared to respond to that. There are a variety of other security things that I would be happy to discuss in a different forum, but the point is their mission has now been specifically focused, again, on the physical and the personnel security of this complex.
Mr. Chairman, as I said at the outset, I'm glad both of these men are here. Thank you.
Certainly. Representative Rissman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question for the superintendent. On your presentation, you mentioned out-of-state applicants. Is that like a lateral transfer in, and do they have to be troopers, or they have to go through a process, or can somebody from a city just lateral into the troopers? And someone out of state, how do they fit into our retirement system if they're in another retirement system in a different state?
Sure. So two answers, and I'll try to get them right. The first question with respect to how does a lateral from out of state work, state statute, the Kansas Law Enforcement Training Center, and the Kansas Commission on Peace Officer Standards and Training all recognize what we call reciprocity. So if someone who is certified in another state can submit themselves or subject themselves to a short curriculum followed by a challenge exam specific to Kansas law, then they can realize reciprocity. What we would do at Highway Patrol then is, rather than just bless them to go work on the streets, they would go to our condensed academy. So it would be reciprocity plus a condensed 12 or 14-week academy.
Okay, so if somebody had 5 years experience, let's say in Arkansas, and they came here, they would have 5 years towards their retirement, or?
So no, that part actually is the second part of the answer. They would have to begin new in KP&F or CAPERS, depending on the employing agency. So, like, for example, I had 9 years at Sedgwick County Sheriff before I left to go to another agency. I had to start fresh. I had to start over.
Thank you. Representative Slingensieben.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, all of you, for your presentations. For the last two appropriations bills, we have provided a retirement card and the ability to buy the service revolver to Capitol Police officers, because apparently that wasn't possible before. My question is it possible to take care of that in a different way so we don't have to put it in the appropriations bill? In other words, that we treat those officers like anyone else and allow them to have a retirement card and to buy their service revolver when they finally retire, all things being equal and eligible.
Thank you for that question, sir. I did not know that was a thing, and that will not require a legislative fix. I'll treat them the same as I do troopers.
I appreciate that answer. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Any final questions, committee? Representative Mon.
Thank you, Superintendent. So the training facility, I understand that it needs upgrades. Would it be more, I guess, fiscally responsible if the troopers simply went to KLETC and we expanded that facility rather than put $7 million into your facility? Would there be some way to reach that type of agreement?
Well, our training curriculum and our training program is about twice the length of the basic training at KLETC. So at the outset, I would say that that proposal would only accomplish about half of the need that KHP has. The second thing that I would say, I think just off the top of my head, is I don't know that they have the capacity to do both what they need and what we need at the same facility. I would also add that there are a host of functions at the training center in Salina that we conduct jointly with KLETC. Much like I read recently that the KBI has entered into a partnership with KLETC for certain investigative and forensic type training. The Highway Patrol does the same thing with impaired driving training in conjunction with prosecutors from the Attorney General's office. So our breath alcohol unit and our drug recognition expert program is all based in Salina. I happen to believe, and it's a good question because it does spark a lot of thinking, but I do happen to believe that where I sit and from what I see and what I know about the problem, I think that there's room for both academies. And I think that there's a need for the Highway Patrol because their mission set is unique and it carries with it responsibilities both under state and certainly federal transportation laws, the need for additional training.
Certainly. All right, committee, I think we're out of time for today. Ladies and gentlemen, just thank you guys, all you law enforcement officers, thank you for being here. Thank you for making the time to take the trip, to share with us your thoughts and concerns. And I'm certain that I speak for the committee when I say we really appreciate all that you do for the citizens of the state of Kansas. So thank you. We'll be adjourned.